Once upon a time, not too long ago, a chief executive is in his office engaged in a telephone conversation with his friend Stan. Well, very interesting. Well, I've suspected that scenario for years. I'll have to watch the news when I get home. Hey, Stan, thanks for the information. Stay in touch. I'll talk to you soon, said Dan Trent. He placed his cell phone on a desk with an African blackwood top. Dan Trent was born in July of 1966. He is of medium height with graying hair. Although he has boyish features, his long ponytail and beard make him appear older than his 57 years. Dan Trent graduated from a junior college with an associate's degree in mechanical design. His first position was as an engineer in a plastic fabricating company. That is where Dan Trent met his mentor, Frank Zach. Frank was the same age as Dan Trent's mother. Frank was a handsome man with snow-white hair. He had a booming voice and he cursed like a trooper. Frank Zach took Dan Trent under his wing and treated him like a son. When Dan Trent left the company, Frank smiled and said, "Hey, stay in touch, Johnny." Dan Trent's next position was as the plant manager of an electrical equipment manufacturing company. It was there where Dan Trent honed his management skills. 3 years later, Frank Zach asked Dan Trent to be the president of a plastic fabricating company that he was starting. He offered Dan Trent 49% ownership. Dan Trent jumped at the chance, but soon learned the value of 51% ownership. The company thrived under Dan Trent's leadership and his innovative manufacturing techniques. When Frank Zach passed away, his widow sold the business to a holding company. The chairman of the holding company asked Dan Trent to take over a company in the group that was on the verge of bankruptcy. Dan reluctantly did and restored the company to record profits. Eventually, Dan became disenchanted with the chairman. The chairman refused to share the profits with the people who worked hard to turn the company around. One evening at dinner, Rosa looked at Dan with a concern and said, "What's wrong? Another bad meeting with the chairman?" Dan frowned and said, "I can't work for that man anymore." Rosa smiled and said, "Well, you're not going to work for anybody else again." Dan looked at Rosa with a serious look and said, "You know what that means?" Rosa said, "We sell a house to get working capital and no partners." Dan and Rosa Trent founded Metatron Industries. It became the world's largest manufacturer of disposable medical products. Dan Trent's personal net worth is purported to be in the neighborhood of $3 billion. Much of his wealth was the result of shrewd real estate investments and patent royalties. Dan Trent looked at his watch and frowned. Rosa's going to be mad again," said Dan Trent. He put on a denim jacket and took an elevator down to his private indoor garage. He walked over to a 2003 Harley-Davidson Electric Light Classic motorcycle, glistening with chrome. Dan Trent mounted the shiny black motorcycle. He pulled out the choke and thumbed the starter button. The motorcycle roared to life. Dan Trent smiled as he listened to the rumble of the Harley's engine. He exited the garage and soon was driving on back country roads. Dan Trent smiled again as he heard the sound of Bo Diddley coming through the Harley's CD player. After a 40-minute ride, Dan Trent arrived at his lakefront estate. He entered and was greeted by his wife, Rosa Trent. "Well, it's about time," said Rosa with a slight frown. Rosa is an attractive woman of Italian descent with long raven black hair. She looks much younger than her age of 59 years. Rosa would laugh when her husband called her his cougar. Dan Trent smiled and said, "I'm only an hour late. I got hung up on the phone with Stan." Rosa frowned and said, "I don't like you driving that motorcycle when it's dark. Besides, now the supper got cold." Although most of Rosa's time was spent overseeing the many charities and foundations she and Dan sponsored, Rosa insisted on cooking a meal for Dan every so often. She cooked mostly Italian dishes that she learned from her mother. "So what were you and Stan discussing that hung you up for so long?" said Rosa. Dan Trent poured a glass of Cabernet for himself and said, "We were talking about the government's wasteful spending. Someone did some rather intensive investigatings, and the things they found were almost too hard to believe. It's all over the news. Let's eat in the family room. I want to turn the news on." "No, let's eat in the dining room. I've got everything set up in there. The news can wait," said Rosa. While they were having dinner, Rosa discussed one of the charities she and Dan sponsored. "They're having a fundraiser next month, and I promised that you would be the main speaker," said Rosa. Dan Trent took a sip of the wine and said, "No problem, as long as it doesn't interfere with my Sturgis trip. The lasagna was excellent." Rosa shook her head and said, "You and those damn motorcycles. And another thing, when are you going to get a regular haircut? You look like an old hippie." They went into the family room and turned the TV on to their favorite news channel, True News. The channel host said, "Here are but a few of the items discovered by one of our senior investigative reporters, with the help of a few whistleblowers." Dan Trent shook his head in disbelief and then pointed to the television screen and said, $33 million to fund a monkey colony, among other things. That's sheer lunacy." "Well, I certainly agree that it's disgraceful, but I don't know what we can do about it," said Rosa. "Well, neither do I," said Dan Trent. Dan Trent and Rosa are again watching their favorite news channel, True News. The channel host said, "Tonight we have Sal Hennessy with us. Sal has some interesting facts to present to our listeners. Sal?" Sal Hennessy nodded and said, "Thanks for inviting me. Well, currently the U.S. government employs approximately 3 million civilian workers across all agencies. This does not include the military, but includes approximately 600 U.S. Postal Service employees who are part of a quasi-independent federal agency. Roughly 2.4 million non-postal civilian employees work in departments like Defense, Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, and more." To put this in perspective, 1 in every 53 U.S. workers is a federal employee, accounting for roughly 1.9% of the national workforce. Here's a startling fact. There is approximately 1 government worker for every 115 people in the USA. Dan Trent pointed to the television screen and said, "And the hits just keep on coming." "That's hard to believe, 1 government worker for every 115 people, but I don't know what we can do about it," says Rosa. "Neither do I, but it sure gets a person thinking," said Dan Trent. Dan Trent and Rosa are again watching their favorite news channel, True News. The channel host said, "Tonight, Sal Hennessy will be talking about the upcoming federal budget." "Sal?" Sal Hennessy nodded and said, "Thanks for inviting me. On the screen is the proposed budget for 2024. As you can see, there is a deficit of $2 trillion. That's pretty scary to me. But here's something even scarier. Here's a chart that shows how much the national debt has grown through the years and how much each citizen owes with a projection for 2025. Rosa said, "So to pay off the national debt, every citizen would have to come up with over 100 grand. even our children and grandchildren. That's right, my dear, said Dan Trent. Rosa sighed. Not much we can do about it, is there? Dan Trent said, there might be. Dan Trent and Rosa are again watching their favorite news channel, True News. The channel host said, we have a news flash. Another young woman was just killed by an illegal immigrant. We will pass on more details as we receive them. Dan Trent stood up angrily and said, that is enough. Rosa looked at Dan with a puzzled look and said, why are you getting so upset? There's nothing we can do. Dan Trent sat down and clasped his hands together. He looked at Rosa and said, there is something we can do, my dear. And what is that, Dan? Said Rosa. We need to get some new people running this country. Some of the people in office have never held a real job. I've come to the conclusion that a lot of people in office are more concerned about staying in office than doing what's good for our country. Look at the inflation figures and the rising national debt. They're at an all-time high. And $33 million spent on a monkey colony. $2 billion on maintaining and leasing unused properties. $101 billion lost to Medicare and Medicaid fraud and improper payments. The list goes on and on. If we ran our businesses that irresponsibly, we'd be bankrupt in 6 months. Look at how many people have been killed because of our open borders. And now another one. This country of ours will not last the way it's going, said Dan Trent. But what can we do, said Rosa. Dan smiled and said, I have an idea. It's something that's been bouncing around in my head for quite a while. With a look of curiosity, Rosa looked at Dan and said, and pray tell, what would that be? Dan was about to speak when on the television, the True News channel host started interviewing a well-known senator who was his party's leading presidential candidate. When asked what he would do about an important issue, the senator immediately would deflect the question and severely bash and insult his opponents. Dan Trent paused for a few seconds and then said, look at that guy. He's more interested in throwing insults and making cutesy remarks than actually addressing the important issues. And sadly, both parties do that. Never ever do I ever bash a competitor. I would tell them what Metatron could do for their business and how we would accomplish our promises. Here's my idea. Why not start a new independent political party and come up with a consortium or team of the most capable and qualified people for cabinet positions, president and vice president, and so forth. These would be people of true integrity who wouldn't use their position to make themselves wealthy. They would tell the voters why each person was selected and how this team will solve our country's problems. Rosa said, that all sounds good, Dan, but who could organize and spearhead something like that? Dan Trent gave Rosa a big, broad smile. Rosa frowned and said, don't tell me you're thinking of running for president. Where did you get an idea like that? Dan Trent laughed and said, heavens no. I tell it like it is. I'd make a lousy politician. But I am going to take a shot at organizing everything. I'm going to call this new independent party 2024. I came up with the idea while riding my Harley out to Sturgis. Well, why 2024? Said Rosa with a slightly puzzled look. Dan's face took on a serious look and he said, because 2024 will be the most important election in the history of the United States, maybe in the history of the entire world. Rosa smiled and said, are you going to keep that ponytail and beard? Dan Trent grinned and said, why not? I'm not running for president. Hey, sweetheart, let's go upstairs. The dictionary defines a consortium as an agreement, combination, or group formed to undertake an enterprise beyond the resources of any one member. Out of an unused office in Metatron's main facility, Dan Trent founded the 2024 Independent Political Party. When the press corps received word of the new independent political party, they reacted in a malicious, negative manner and said, "Has Dan Trent lost his marbles?" Dan Trent contacted people who would be trusted and respected to help him organize a new party. Some of them agreed with him and others told him not to waste his time. Dan Trent also received anonymous threats telling him to back off or else. Dan Trent ignored the threats and immediately went to work on developing a plan of action. He developed a list of critical issues to address. Dan Trent's next step was to recruit a group of the most eminent and renowned minds in the areas of finance, foreign affairs, energy, business and manufacturing, education, defense, military affairs, and healthcare. This group or team would be selected for their integrity and honesty, along with a strong desire to work for the good of the United States of America. Dan Trent was unanimously elected the chairman of 2024. Dan Trent moved 2024 to a larger facility in Lincoln, Nebraska. It was centrally located and had a good airport. Dan Trent said Lincoln, Nebraska was also named after one of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln. In the new Lincoln facility, Chairman Trent addressed the group and said, "Welcome to 2024. I want to thank you all for giving up your valuable time to be a part of 2024. I believe we all realize that we have one more chance to save this great country of ours. Successful businesses are run by qualified and proficient boards of directors. The directors of a successful business put their egos aside and they work for the good of the business." Ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what we're going to do. In this room are some of the most experienced and brilliant minds in the country, perhaps in the entire world. Our success will result from our ability to work together as a team. Our task will be twofold. From this group, we will first select a cabinet along with a vice president and presidential candidate. Secondly, the entire team will work together in developing a specific, concise plan on how 2024 will address the issues that are ruining this beloved country of ours. We will present this to the voting public, along with why a specific person was selected for the position on 2024. Let's go to work. After 3 months of intense meetings and discussions, 2024 made their choices for the following 25 positions. Egos were put aside and the selections were based on experience, a record of accomplishments, character, honesty, and integrity. As part of the selection process, a plan was developed on how the person selected would address the issues related to their positions. 2024 was now ready to present a team to the voting public with solid reasons why and how they will get the job done. When 2024 announced their plan, Dan was surprised and pleased at the positive response. He was especially pleased with the amount of donations made to help finance their campaign. This enabled 2024 to do a respectable amount of television advertising along with a series of town hall meetings. The voting public began to take notice and 2024 started to rise in the polls. Both major parties did not appear concerned until the 2024 team rose to the 15% area in most major polls. With the large amount of contributions pouring in, 2024 scheduled its largest town hall meeting to date. It would be held on January 8th, 2024 in Chicago at McCormick Place. The entire 2024 team would be present. They were all staying at a major hotel near McCormick Place. Prior to the evening's town hall meeting, the entire 2024 team was attending a luncheon meeting in the hotel banquet room. After lunch was served, Chairman Trent walked up to a podium and addressed the team. As he began to speak, two servers pulled out MP5 machine guns from a cart. One of the servers' guns jammed. She was immediately tackled and restrained. The other server opened fire and hit Dan Trent in the shoulder. He fell behind the podium. The server turned slightly and fired a burst at the presidential selection. Before she could squeeze the trigger for a second burst, a shot rang out. She was hit in the head with a 9mm round and fell to the ground. One shooter died at the scene and the other shooter was taken into custody. The presidential selection and Dan Trent were rushed to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The presidential selection died in the ambulance. Dan Trent's wounds were serious, but he would recover quickly. He was visited by Marine General Daniel Adams, a 2024 team member. It was the general who fired the shot that saved many lives. When Dan Trent thanked the general for averting a massacre, General Adams sighed and said, "I wish I could have reacted quicker and saved Mr. Mills. He would have been a great president." "Yes, he would have, but please don't blame yourself, General. You saved a lot of lives," said Dan Trent in a very faint voice. The January 8th, 2024 town hall meeting went on without incident and with record attendance. A video message from Chairman Trent's bedside was shown to the town hall attendees on a large screen. He received a 5-minute standing ovation. 1 week later, Dan Trent returned to his duties as the 2024 chairman. With the untimely death of their presidential selection, 2024 made a unanimous choice. Dan Trent reluctantly agreed to be the 2024 party's selection for President of the United States. On the way home, Dan stopped at his favorite barber shop. When Dan Trent returned home that evening, Rosa shrieked when a clean-shaven husband with a short haircut entered and kissed her. Rosa said, "My goodness, you look 20 years younger." Dan smiled and said, "I don't think an old hippie could ever get elected president." Rosa held Dan's hand and said, "Dan, are you sure you want to run for president? What do you know about politics and running the country? Besides, you're still weak from that bullet wound." Dan Trent said, "Hell, I'm firmly convinced that I know more about politics and running the country than a lot of the people who are now in office." A big grin appeared on Dan Trent's face. "Besides, I'm not that weak. How about going upstairs?" Rosa smiled and took her husband's hand. Dan Trent hugged Rosa and they walked arm in arm up the winding staircase. 2024 continued their campaign, telling the voting public what they would do and how they would do it. Dan Trent refrained from bashing his opponents. When a reporter told Dan Trent that one of his opponents called him a jerk-off who didn't know what the hell he was doing, Dan Trent smiled and said, "Well, he's entitled to his opinion." Candidate McCrae explained the rationale behind the selection of their vice presidential candidate. Ron Durham was a man in his mid-40s who was a leader in the healthcare industry and a naval officer well-versed in military affairs. Candidate Trent said he would only serve one term, while Ron Durham gains valuable experience in order to carry on the principles of the 2024 party. In the next poll, 2024 advanced another 5 points. The authorities were determined to find out who was behind the shooting at the 2024 town hall meeting. The surviving shooter was found to be an illegal immigrant from a South American country. Under intense interrogation, she did not utter a single word. The authorities were frustrated. A breakthrough finally appeared one evening in an unusual way. After a fundraising dinner, the member of a well-known senator's staff stopped at a lounge in a hotel frequented by politicians and lobbyists. Kevin Sanford had 3 martinis at the dinner. He ordered his 4th martini of the evening and lit a cigarette. Kevin told the bartender that he held an important job on the senator's staff. He went on to say that the senator would someday become president of the United States, and that he, Kevin Sanford, would be chief of staff and a big man in Washington. The bartender, James Wallace, said nothing but listened intently to Kevin's drunken ramblings. Kevin continued to talk about his future. Kevin began to slur his words, and he said, "Yeah, I handle special jobs for the senator. I took care of Mills, and we'll get that idiot Trent for sure." The bartender was shocked and startled by the remark, but retained his composure and said, "Sir, you're in no shape to die. Let me call Uber for you." Kevin agreed, and the bartender called Uber. Kevin thanked the bartender and gave him a $20 bill. James Wallace put the $20 bill in his vest pocket and promptly called his former commanding officer, General Daniel Adams. James Wallace served under the general in the Gulf War. He told General Adams about his conversation with the senator's staffer. Kevin Sanford was taken into custody for questioning. Kevin Sanford was belligerent and said, "Do you assholes know who I am? Do you know who you're dealing with? What? You jerks are going to take the word of some shit-ass bartender? I'll have your jobs for this." Kevin's arrogance turned to sheer horror when the detective played a recording of his conversation with the bartender. James Wallace had secretly recorded Kevin Sanford's remarks on his cell phone. Kevin Sanford broke down in tears and buried his face in his hands. He told him there were 2 senators involved, his boss and a senator from the other party. To his knowledge, the senators acted alone. It was a perfect plan gone wrong. The 2 shooters were professionals. No one would ever suspect that 2 women servers would be a security risk. Had the gun not jammed, 2024 would have ceased to exist. Warrants were issued for the arrest of the 2 senators. One of the senators was tipped off of his impending arrest. Prior to his arrest, he succumbed to an overdose of barbiturates and alcohol. The surviving senator was taken into custody. The evidence from his staffer was damning, and the senator was cooperative. The senator confirmed Kevin Sanford's story and said they did act alone. After the details of the arrest were released, 2024 rose another 5 points in the polls. Prior to the 2 major parties' conventions, they held a series of debates among their candidates for president. At all of their debates, insults and accusations were hurled. Candidates interrupted and talked over each other. When a question was asked that could be answered with a simple yes or no, the candidates would change the subject. Candidate Trent told Rosa, "The children are at it again. When it's all over, they'll be the best of buddies." 2024 held no inter-party debates. 2024 told the voting public exactly what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, and who was going to do it. And most important of all, why the team selected was qualified to accomplish the 2024 party's plans and promises. Prior to the presidential debates, it was leaked to the press that candidate Trent's Vail condo was paid for by a large corporation. It was also said that Metatron gave bribes to certain senators for favors. Candidate Trent answered all of the allegations by furnishing personal and corporate tax returns, along with Metatron's financial statements. Candidate Trent was also accused of having affairs with some of his female staffers. All of the allegations proved to be false. Candidate Trent was highly criticized for not having a full college degree. The media went on to say, "You don't want to elect an uneducated bumpkin for president." Candidate Trent laughed and said, "I guess I did okay on just an associate's degree." The 2024 party participated in a presidential debate with the two major parties. The debate was not civil, and the two major parties ganged up on candidate Trent. They frequently interrupted candidate Trent and vehemently disputed the logic of 2024's master plans for solving the nation's problems. Candidate Trent was well prepared and clearly explained the rationale behind 2024's plans of action. He went further and talked about the people selected for the various cabinet positions. He told why they were selected and why they would be successful. When accused of running for president only to increase his wealth, candidate Trent said, "My net worth is over $3 billion. I've got more money than I could spend in a lifetime. I'm running for president because I love this beautiful country of ours, and the way it's currently being run, it won't last another 4 years." The pundits praised candidate Trent's performance. The major polls said the 2024 presidential race was too close to call. Campaign contributions continued to flow in, which allowed 2024 to hold a series of town hall meetings throughout the country, along with many television ads. The town hall meetings and the television ads were instrumental and effective in getting the 2024 party's message out to the voting public. Election day finally arrived. Candidate Trent refused to watch the news networks speculate on who was winning. He told Rosa, "I've done all I can. It's in the hands of the voters and the Lord above." Candidate Trent spent the morning of Election Day skiing at Vail. He made one run down the double black diamond run named Highline. Highline held special memories for Dan Trent. It was on Highline where he met Rosa during a college ski club outing. In early afternoon, Dan Trent flew back to 2024's campaign headquarters in Lincoln, Nebraska. At 11:30 p.m. on Tuesday, November 5th, 2024, candidate Trent's opponent conceded the election. Dan Trent was elected the 47th President of the United States of America by a respectable margin. As predicted, the two opposing parties and the media disputed the election. On January 20th, 2025, Dan Trent was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States of America. After taking the oath of office, President Trent marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in freezing temperatures, with Rosa Trent at his side and the 2024 team following him. President Trent entered the White House and immediately went to the Oval Office. On his first day in office with Rosa Trent and the 2024 team present, President Trent signed the following executive orders. Immediately after President Trent signed the executive orders, the television news networks had a field day with their negative comments and analysis. Some of the comments were, "He will ruin this country. He won't last 3 months. He's a madman." That evening, after the inaugural ball, Dan and Rosa Trent were relaxing in a presidential suite. Rosa said, "This is all so unreal. I'm having a hard time falling asleep." President Trent pointed to a TV and said, "Well, that didn't take long. They call me a madman and say I won't last 3 months. We'll see about that." "Turn that garbage off, Dan. How about giving me a back rub?" said Rosa with a smile. President Trent's private cell phone rings. He looked at the caller ID and smiled, then looked at Rosa and said, "Be with you in a minute, my dear." "Hello, Eli." President Trent and Eli Mann talked for 45 minutes. President Trent is seated at his desk in the Oval Office. He is studying a report from the Joint Chief of Staff. He smiles and shakes his head. Just then, a knock is heard on the door. "Come in," said President Trent. He is surprised to see his personal secretary, Dorothy Adams, and says, "Why, Dorothy, what brings you in so early?" "Well, I was sure you would be in your office early today, Mr. President, and I wanted to see if you would need anything," said Dorothy. "Well, that's very thoughtful of you," said President Trent. "Mr. President, we have a slight problem. Eli Mann is at the front gate. He said you were expecting him. Did you know he's coming to see you?" said Dorothy with a concerned look. President Trent smiled and said, "Yes, I did. Please have him shown in. Eli is an old friend. We go back a long way. And Dorothy, I appreciate you being here for me so early." "Thank you, Mr. President," said Dorothy. Eli Mann entered the Oval Office and shook hands with President Trent. Eli Mann is 39 years old and purported to be the second richest man in the world. It's been said that Eli Mann may become the world's first trillionaire. His vast wealth comes from the many innovative products he invented, such as computer hardware, electric vehicles, communication satellites, and low-cost housing, to name a few. When Eli Mann invents a product, he would start a company and, under his personal supervision, manufacture the product. His manufacturing techniques are sure genius, which result in high profitability. Eli Mann is tall with long blonde hair and a serious but handsome look. Eli Mann smiles and says, "Congratulations, Don. I hope you didn't mind the late call yesterday. All those executive orders really put the hook in me." "Not at all. Sit down, Eli. You want some coffee?" said President Trent. No coffee for me, but do you mind if I smoke?" said Eli Mann. President Trent grinned and said, "Go ahead, long as it isn't a joint. I don't want to be the first president impeached for having pot in the Oval Office." "Eli, I always knew that politics was a dirty business, but not this dirty. So tell me, what are your ideas about addressing the problem of wasteful spending in our government?" Eli Mann lit his cigarette with a match and said, "I've been following the waste that's currently being reported, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Some of the things this government spends tax dollars on are freaking insane. What really puzzles me is how a politician who earns $174,000 a year can end up with a net worth of $10 or $20 or $50 million or more. There could be a tie-in to all of this wasteful spending and the very wealthy politicians. I have the resources to get to the bottom of all this, and I've done some preliminary investigating and research. Do you recall that $33 million allocated to a federal-funded monkey colony?" "I sure do," said President Trent. Eli Mann puffed on his cigarette and said, "We found some highly irregular and highly excessive payments that were made to senators and congressmen from both parties for travel expenses. There were also some other suspicious payments made." "Well, who is we, and how did you find us out?" said President Trent. Eli Mann smiled and said, "That's my business, but don't worry, we've done nothing illegal." "What do you suggest we do about this, Eli?" said President Trent. "For starters, we need to make damn sure the various oversight committees are doing their job. When a sum of money is allocated, we absolutely have to know where the money and how the money will be spent. We just can't blindly allocate large sums of money without knowing where it's going. What I'd also like to do is send an anonymous letter to the senators who received these bogus payments. Let them know someone is aware of their fraud," said Eli. President Trent smiled and said, "You have my blessing, but please keep me in the loop. Let us decide together on all further actions on this. Say, Eli, when do you think you will be planting an American flag on Mars?" Eli Mann grinned as he shook Dan Trent's hand and said, "Sooner than you think, Mr. President." Several senators and congressmen from each party are attending a meeting behind closed doors. Senator Posey asked for the group's attention and said, "You know why we're all here, gentlemen. How many of you have received an anonymous letter about travel expenses?" All 7 senators and 6 congressmen raised their hands. Senator Posey frowned and said, "We all know who is behind this. Gentlemen, we must absolutely stop this son of a bitch at all costs. Oppose everything Dan Trent does. Find a way to impeach him. I want him out of office before the midterms." A senator rose and said, "I'll bet Eli Mann is involved in this too." "I'm sure he is. We need to stop that son of a bitch too," said Senator Posey. President Trent was in office 3 months when a story was leaked to the media that he had help from Russia to win the election. Documents were produced that implicated President Trent, and impeachment proceedings immediately commenced. The situation looked grim for President Trent until a whistleblower came forth with a shocking revelation. It was proven that Senator Milton had paid a Russian operative to draft the false documents. Senator Milton denied the allegations and kept her office, but the impeachment proceedings were immediately dropped. President Trent's joy was short-lived. 2 weeks later, he was impeached again. It was purported that he had bribed a congressman to get a favorable ruling on a bill that would greatly benefit one of his real estate deals. The congressman passed away 2 years ago, but his widow verified the transaction. She is currently married to Senator Posey. This time there was no whistleblower, and the situation again looked very grim for President Trent. The 2 major parties and the media again had a field day. They joyfully said, "Trent is the first president in history to be impeached twice while in office." Their joy ended when Senator Posey's wife discovered that he was having an affair with a young office staffer. She immediately filed for divorce and told Congress that her husband asked her to lie about the bribe. Senator Posey was removed from office and indicted. The media made little mention of the 2 failed impeachments and continued to severely criticize President Trent. President Trent became one of the most accessible and transparent presidents in history. He would take the time to speak with anyone, anywhere. His press conferences and speeches were done without the use of a teleprompter or cue cards. He used handwritten notes for his major speeches. Every speech was severely criticized by the 2 major parties and the media. President Trent's frequent cabinet meetings were also televised. President Trent would continue to reach out to the leaders of both parties and ask for their help in unifying the nation. President Trent's policies were beginning to work. The flow of illegal immigrants slowed down to a trickle. With the decrease in gasoline prices, inflation started to slowly go down. But in spite of the positive things President Trump did and was beginning to accomplish, everything he did was severely criticized by the 2 parties and the media. The media even criticized President Trent's wardrobe. Once in a while, President Trent wore a pinstripe vested suit with colored dress shirts and custom Jerry Garcia neckties. When President Trent wore a double-breasted navy blue blazer with brass buttons while greeting a head of state, the media went wild. President Trent spearheaded a private foundation to research and reduce a rare form of childhood cancer. He brought in scientists from all over the world. As a result of the foundation's research, this form of childhood cancer was virtually eliminated. The media did not mention the foundation's success. Eli Mann became one of President Trent's valued advisors. He was instrumental in starting a commission to study wasteful spending in the government. The findings were made public and ruffled feathers in both major parties, and resulted in the indictments of some members in each major party. The media reported the indictments as political retribution and again called for President Trent's impeachment. President Trent and Eli Mann were holding a press conference in the Rose Garden to answer questions about the Commission's recent findings on the billions lost to Medicare and Medicaid fraud and the millions paid to unemployment benefits for incarcerated individuals. The questions were brutal and sarcastic. President Trent was chiding a reporter for his snotty demeanor when a shot rang out. The shot hit Eli Mann in the head. Secret Service agents covered the president and whisked him away to safety. Eli Mann was flown by helicopter to Walter Reed Memorial Hospital at President Trent's request. The media dismissed the assassination attempt as an interruption to a press conference. President Trent was angered when he heard that a well-known talk show host said, "I'm not surprised, he had it coming." Another talk show host said, "Too bad the bullet missed." Both hosts were suspended but quickly reinstated due to media and celebrity pressure. President Trent entered Eli Mann's room at Walter Reed Hospital. The attending surgeon said Eli Mann was in very critical condition and he was putting his top surgeons to work on Eli. The surgeon said, "We are used to these types of wounds. We should be able to save him." Eli Mann went into surgery. President Trent spent the night at Walter Reed Memorial Hospital. In the morning, when Eli woke up, he looked at President Trent and said in a very weak voice, "Did they get the shooter?" "Not really. The Secret Service had him cornered and he put a bullet in his head. He was an illegal alien who was deported 3 times, said President Trent. In a weak and hoarse voice, Eli Mann said, "And they do nothing but criticize your immigration policy. I wonder what they'd say if one of their loved ones got shot." President Trent frowned and said, "They'd probably blame me." "Dan, do you know why they hate you and oppose and criticize anything you do?" said Eli Mann as he struggled to speak. President Trent smiled and said, "I sure do. I'm an outsider who's not in it for the money." "Eli, please don't talk anymore. Get some rest." Eli Mann gave a faint smile and nodded off to sleep. The sweeping tariff increases inaugurated by President Trent were largely his own initiative, consistent with his views on trade. President Trent was highly criticized for his policies on tariffs. Even some of the 2024 party were critical. However, these tariffs were implemented with input from key advisors and justified using national security and emergency powers. President Trent said, "I'm sick of seeing the United States getting ripped off by other countries. The tariffs will work if they are strategically targeted and accompanied by domestic investment. I'm asking everyone to be patient." President Trent closely monitored his tariff policies. He increased and decreased tariffs as he saw fit. Eventually, his tariff policies resulted in an increase in both domestic and foreign investments. In one of his initial executive orders, President Trent directed DHS to prioritize the removal of individuals with recent unlawful entry and criminal records. When ICE, the Federal Agency for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, enforced the law, protests began. An illegal immigrant with a criminal record, both in the United States and abroad, was deported back to Salvador. Within hours, thousands of protesters appeared. Many of the protesters were paid to protest. In addition to being paid, they also received training, supplies, equipment, and special clothing. Similar scenes appeared all across the nation, but primarily in the Midwest. When illegal immigrants with terrible criminal records raped and murdered young women, nothing was said. When President Trent issued an executive order banning biological men from competing in women's sports, violent protests erupted. President Trent and the 2024 party campaigned on their record, while the two major parties continued to bash and criticize 2024. Their campaign had no real substance. An incredible history-breaking event occurred. Senators and representatives from both major parties began to switch their allegiance to the 2024 party. As senators and representatives moved to the 2024 party, they were scoffed at by the diehards in their own party, but praised by their constituents. The midterm elections came and went, with the 2024 party gaining a majority in the House and Senate by slim margins. 2024's opponents and the media continued to severely criticize President Trent and the 2024 party. The talk of impeachment was always in the air. There was a talk of impeaching President Trent for using his own money to bribe senators and representatives to switch their allegiance to the 2024 party. This was proven to be a false allegation. Even Rosa Trent was a constant subject of media criticism for her charitable works and, among other things, her wardrobe. When ICE continued to arrest and deport illegal immigrants with criminal records, the so-called peaceful protests turned into violent riots. Many of the protesters were paid professionals. One of the largest firms who trained and paid protesters was Pro Actors Incorporated. Their CEO and founder was John Fox. He made his fortune as an advertising executive. John Fox was a former Olympic skier. He was a fitness addict and in great physical condition for a 47-year-old man. John Fox was also known as a Trent hater. He frequently appeared on evening talk shows to voice his hatred for Dan Trent. He often said that deporting illegal immigrants because they had criminal records was criminal itself. Under his direction, Pro Actors Incorporated gave ICE protesters special training. When 2 ICE agents were assassinated, John Fox said, "Well, that's what they get." John Fox went helicopter skiing in British Columbia with some of his former Olympic teammates. He finished a run of 2,500 vertical feet and entered the helicopter to make another run. The pilot put his hand on John Fox's shoulder and said, "Mr. Fox, I'm afraid I have some bad news for you." "What is it?" said John Fox with a concerned look. "Your townhouse in New York was broken into. Your wife and son were taken to a hospital. They are both in critical condition. That's all I've been told. I can have you at the airport in 15 minutes. I'll radio ahead so they can have your plane ready to go," said the pilot. "Thank you," said John Fox. John Fox flew back to New York in his Learjet and rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital. On the flight back, John Fox heard on the news that the assailants were 2 brothers from a South American country. They were both illegal immigrants who had been deported 5 times. Both had criminal records in the United States and their own country for assault with a deadly weapon, among other serious felony charges. At the hospital, John Fox was greeted by the doctor, who updated him on his wife and son's condition. In a soft and grim voice, the doctor said, "Your wife is in critical condition. She was severely beaten and lost a lot of blood. We were able to stop the bleeding, and I'm confident she will recover." "How is my son?" said John Fox impatiently. The doctor put his hand on John Fox's shoulder and said, "Your son is in extremely critical condition. In addition to being severely beaten, he suffered a gunshot wound to the head. Our surgeons are conferring together at this moment to decide on the best course of action to take." In a loud voice, John Fox said, "You mean nothing's been done yet?" The doctor said, "Please calm down, sir. We can't rush into this." Just as John Fox was about to speak, there was a knock on the door, and in walked President Trent. John Fox glared at President Trent and said, What the hell are you doing here? Did you come here to lecture me? In a quiet and serious voice, President Trent said, I came here to offer you our services. I brought with me a team of surgeons from Walter Reed. This is the same team who saved Eli Mann. They are very experienced in this type of wound that your son has. Will you accept our help? John Fox was stunned and momentarily speechless. He recovered and said in a humble voice, Yes, Mr. President, thank you. John Fox turned to the doctor and in a firm but polite voice said, Doctor, I want the team of surgeons from Walter Reed to be in charge of my son. The doctor was visibly shaken and said, Yes, Mr. Fox. John Fox looked at President Trent and said, Sir, why are you helping me after all of the nasty things I said about you? President Trent said, John, I almost lost one of my best friends and top advisors. I also have 2 sons that I worried about. What happened to your son was a tragedy, and you needed our help. With a tear in his eye, John Fox said, Thank you from the bottom of my heart, Mr. President. President Trent gave a soft smile and said, Your son will be okay. These guys know what the hell they're doing. Well, John, I've got to go. I have a country to run. Drop by sometime and I'll give you a tour of the White House. They shook hands and President Trent left. John Fox's son was rushed into surgery. The recovery process was slow, but John Fox II recovered with no lasting effects or complications. 2 months later, John Fox was the guest on the top-rated nighttime talk show. He was announced and sat down next to the host. After a bit of small talk, the host grinned and said, So what do you think of the president's last fiasco? John Fox stood up. He looked at the host and then addressed the audience and said in a serious tone, I'm not here tonight to talk about President Trent's fiasco. I want to talk about the man himself. As you all know, my house was broken into and my wife and son were assaulted. Both were severely beaten and my son was shot in the head. He was at death's door. And who do you think saved his life? President Trent. He brought in a team of surgeons from Walter Reed Memorial Hospital. Just then, the host interrupted John Fox and said, Oh, it's time for a commercial break. The audience chanted, Let him finish, let him finish, let him finish. To the chagrin of the host, there was no commercial break. John Fox continued and said, President Trent. He brought in a team of surgeons from Walter Reed Memorial Hospital who were highly experienced in gunshot wounds to the head. They saved my son's life. The man who I've insulted and criticized many times in this show is the man who saved my son. Mr. President, if you are watching, thank you again from the bottom of my heart. I've ordered Pro Actors Incorporated to cease any protests where ICE is involved. I now see the need to get these criminals out of our country. I'm changing the direction of Pro Actors Inc. into a more useful direction, such as providing security services to schools and churches. John Fox looked at the stunned and speechless host. He smiled and said, Goodbye. He was given a standing, thunderous ovation as he walked off the stage. The next day, the 2 opposing parties and the media dismissed John Fox's speech as a publicity stunt perpetrated by President Trent and the 2024 parties. This time, their negative remarks and undue criticism were met with public outcry. A survey said 76% applauded John Fox's speech and praised President Trent's actions. Protests against ICE slowed down to a trickle. President Trent continually met with the leaders of other countries. He became well known for his negotiating skills and brokered several difficult peace treaties between warring nations. President Trent was criticized for this. His opponents said he should be concentrating on our country instead of other countries and other nations' problems. President Trent was pleasantly surprised when some of the media actually began to praise him for his peace efforts. In the third year of President Trent's term, the 2024 party began preparations for the 2028 elections. The 2024 party changed their name to 2028. The 2028 team used the same campaign format as they used in the 2024 election. Only this time, 2028 would run on their record of achievements. They would tell the voters their plans to maintain their achievements. One of the 2028's party's first order of business was to select their choice of a presidential candidate. President Trent vehemently refused to seek office again. When it was leaked that President Trent was not a candidate, there was a vast public outcry. But this time it was a different kind of outcry. All across the country, people called for President Trent to run again. After a cabinet meeting, Vice President Ron Durham asked President Trent if he could have a word with him in private. After the cabinet members left, President Trent said, "Sit down, Ron. What can I do for you?" Ron Durham bit his lower lip slightly and said, "I'm here on behalf of the 2028 party. We want you to be the 2028 candidate for president again." President Trent shook his head from side to side and said, "No, Ron, no way. Part of my campaign prowess was to only serve one term. Besides, without any doubt, you are the most qualified person to become the next president of the United States of America." Ron Durham smiled and said, "Yes, it's true. I believe I could handle the job. I've learned a lot from you, and the free rein you gave me has given me valuable experience. But I can wait 4 more years. Right now, the people want you. Please consider. Please, Mr. President." President Trent gave Ron Durham a look that was a combination of a smile and a frown. Then he said, "Since you put it that way, let me think on this." The next day, President Trent received several phone calls from prominent members of the 2028 party. They all reiterated Ron Durham's plea to President Trent to run for a second term. That evening at dinner, President Trent looked at Rosa and said, "Well, my dear, you may end up being the First Lady for another 4 years. Rosa Trent grinned and said, "I'm not surprised, Mr. President." Dan Trent gave Rosa a look of gratitude and said, "I couldn't do this without your loving support." The 2028 party announced Dan Trent and Ron Durham as their candidates for president and vice president in the 2028 elections. The two opposing parties held a series of debates to determine their candidates for president and vice president. As in the past, the two opposing parties' debates were vicious and unruly affairs. The debates consisted mainly of the participants hurling insults at each other and calling each other liars to their faces. When it was all over and the candidates were selected, everyone was buddy-buddy again. The 2028 party held no debates. There were 2 more assassination attempts made on President Trent. One attempt was made by an illegal immigrant as President Trent was leaving a restaurant. Vigilant Secret Service agents spotted a woman pulling out a pistol. They subdued and captured her before she could fire a shot. She was angry at President Trent because her husband was recently deported. The husband was a convicted drug trafficker. The second attempt occurred when a Molotov cocktail was thrown at a presidential motorcade. The perpetrator was captured after a lengthy chase. This person was mentally unstable, and the reason for the attempt was never determined. At a news conference, President Trent quipped, "I'm going to go down in history as the only president who was impeached twice, had 3 assassination attempts, and was criticized for his neckties. Can you folks think of anything else I might be famous for?" As he did 4 years ago, President Trent skied at Vail on Election Day. This time he was accompanied by Secret Service agents on snowmobiles. He asked John Fox to join him. John Fox said, "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. President. Say, aren't you concerned about the election?" President Trent smiled and said, "John, I've done all I can. It's in the hands of the voters and the Lord above now. I might as well enjoy myself before the fun starts. I'd like you to fly back with me tonight to our campaign headquarters in Lincoln. You were instrumental in turning the tide of public opinion about me." "It would be an honor, Mr. President. My wife and I will never forget what you did for our son. By the way, he just became a starting guard on his high school varsity hockey team, thanks to you," said John Fox. President Trent smiled and shook John Fox's hand. Later that afternoon, President Trent and John Fox flew back to 2028 campaign headquarters in Lincoln, Nebraska. They were greeted by Rosa Trent and Eli Mann. At 11:30 that evening, President Trent's opponent conceded the election. On a private line, he said to President Trent, "Congratulations, Mr. President. You know, off the record, I wanted to run my campaign like you ran yours. Give the voters a concise plan and tell them how you're going to implement it and why the people selected are qualified to get the job done. The diehards in my party would just not hear of it. Maybe now they will get the message and learn their lesson. Good luck to you, sir. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to help you." "Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. Please drop by the White House sometime. You had some good ideas, and I'd like to discuss them with you." On January 22nd, 2029, Dan Trent was sworn in as the 48th President of the United States of America. No executive orders were produced that day. President Trent held a meeting and reached out to the leaders of the two other major parties. He asked for their help and cooperation. After the meeting, more senators and representatives from the other two major parties switched their allegiance to the 2028 party. The 2028 party now had control of the Senate and House of Representatives by a substantial majority. There were still debates in the House and Senate, but they were healthy and constructive debates. All parties worked together and important bills were passed. At the end of 2029, inflation remained under 2%. The nation was energy independent. Our borders were secure. Crime in major cities was at an all-time low. Our military was second to none. The USA was respected again as a world leader. The nation had a balanced budget, and the national debt was reduced. The United States of America prospered. At his second State of the Union message, President Trent said, "My fellow Americans, this is a speech that I've wanted to give for over 5 years. I want to thank the members of the other two major parties for their help and cooperation in making the United States of America the finest country in the world, perhaps in the entire history of the world. Sure, we still have our differences, but we discuss our differences in a civil and respectful manner. As you have all witnessed, when differences in how to accomplish common goals are discussed in a civil and intelligent manner, it's much easier to see the other side's point of view and ideas. And I'll be the first to admit, at times the other person's point of view and ideas may be better than yours. You can all see how this new spirit of cooperation and understanding has benefited this great nation of ours. President Trent talked in detail about all of the accomplishments that were the result of this new spirit of cooperation and understanding in America. President Trent said in closing, "Thank you, everyone, and God bless America." As all fairy tales end, the United States of America lived happily ever after.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of gray, for purple mountains, majesty above the to claim America, America. God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea. Oh, beautiful for patriot dream that sees beyond the year. Thine alabaster cities gloom, undimmed by human tears. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea.